David Cage, along with his company Quantic Dream, is well known for unique gaming experiences. After working as a composer himself, Cage eventually developed his first title, The Nomad Soul, in the late 90s, which came with original music by, of all people, David Bowie. From that debut game, Quantic Dream made it clear how much importance they place on sound, which has continued through popular releases like Fahrenheit and Heavy Rain. As I record this podcast, Cage and Quantic's latest game is Detroit Become Human, a detailed sci-fi narrative with some of the company's most ambitious music yet. In order to best score the story's 3 playable characters, a trio of top-tier composers joined the project, each focusing on one thread of an interweaving narrative. For Connor, an android police investigator, Nima Fakhrara mixed an array of hardware synths and custom instruments with electric strings to great effect. Philip Sheppard, known for lavish orchestral arrangements, made the very best of Abbey Road and his own inspiration for Kara's emotional arc. Finally, John Paesano, who gamers may know for Marvel's Spider-Man, wrote soaring, almost biblical themes to accompany Markus. I'm Lee Tyrrell, and this is the Sound Test, where I look in depth at video game audio and music, along with the very people who crafted it. Though unable to schedule a conversation with John Paesano, I'm fortunate enough to be joined by both Nima Fakhrara and Philip Sheppard throughout this episode. Together, we'll explore their different soundtracks for Detroit Become Human, the production processes that fueled them, and some thoughts about composing for games in general. Both Nima and Philip have worked extensively in other mediums, and have some interesting perspectives on how they adapt to the world of VGM. To begin, let's mirror the opening of Detroit itself. Initially, players are given control of Connor as he tackles a tense hostage situation. All the while, music by Nima bubbles in the background, setting the tone for Connor's character. Its electronic elements are immediately apparent, appropriately enough for an android, but there's an emergent flicker of life too. We'll soon consider some of the philosophy behind that, and certainly more on the production that achieved it. But first things first, what made Nima right for the role?
I guess I'm the most robotic one of all of them, but no. I'm not too sure, actually, to be honest with you, why I was chosen for Connor, but it fit right in with what I was doing. I'm not a classically trained composer. I've studied percussion. I'm a Persian classical musician, to say the least. And then I've done film scores because I just love it, and I've been able to kind of massage my craft into being able to do video game and film scoring. I like to say I'm a experimental composer that knows how to write classical scores. So I guess it was and I have a vast knowledge of analog and modular synthesizers, and basically, I guess Connor is that. Connor knows everything, but doesn't know everything at the same time. The decision was more of a collaborative thing between Mary Lockwood and Aurelienne over at Quantic, the music supervisor and the audio director, as well as David Cage. So what I basically received a call from Mary, who is the music soup on the project, and was asking for my interest on the project. I knew of Detroit from the E3 announcement, and so I immediately said yes without knowing what I was getting myself into. And from the E3 announcement, there was no reveal of that there will be multiple characters. So after actually I signed a contract and everything, then I realized there are multiple characters and there are 2 other composers that I would be working with. However, even then, I wasn't aware of how much collaboration needs to be done with them, and what the scenario is as far as our input within each other's kind of world.
On the whole, Nima's music is kept separate from Philip and John's, except for a few key moments where characters overlap. Even during production, the 3 musicians were discouraged from intermingling or hearing each other's work. That allowed for each to singularly define their own portions of the story. While Nima played with modular synths and filters for Connor, Philip struck up his ever-faithful orchestra for Kara. We'll soon take a much closer look at the instrumental sounds they each chose. But for Philip, writing a video game OST was virgin territory. Nima, on the other hand, had previously composed for both 1979 Revolution, Black Friday, and Resident Evil Revelations 2. So how did it feel for Philip to take on a whole new medium, despite years of writing for film, TV, and live events like the 2008 Olympics?
It was completely different. I mean, you're right, it was absolutely my first project, and I mean, I think the strange thing for me was the very long lead times in games was something that I'm not used to in the movie world. And I don't generally work in fiction, in drama. I tend to work in documentary when it comes to films. So that's often quite last minute, the things that get put together. So with the gaming, yeah, the long process was kind of great, but also a real challenge, because I love working under deadline. I've never missed a deadline in my life, and actually the focus that you get when you've only got 2 weeks to write and record something is kind of great, because your brain goes into a mode where you think, okay, I actually have to, number 1, think of something quickly, number 2, just not even think about how I'm going to do it or if it's possible, and then the adrenaline just kicks in and it happens. When you've got a year, it's really hard to apply pressure to your brain to kind of make fast, almost, I call them limbic decisions, you know, when something's like a kind of reflex rather than over-considered. Because I think when I write music that's really, really over-considered, it kind of sucks. As in you start to think, what will people like, rather than what makes me feel. It's as simple as that, right? And honestly, the best ideas are really fast ideas. You can spend then a long time producing them and making them polished and beautiful. But sometimes if it's taking you a really long time to think of them, it probably take people a really long time to like them as well. So I've never quite cracked that. And even now, I've learned when I have a long deadline, I will create extraordinarily short ones through it for myself that sometimes the director doesn't have any awareness of. themselves. So there was that. There was also the thing of I suppose dealing with a sort of technical language that I genuinely had no understanding of at all. And I learned a long time ago, actually, if I don't understand something, I'll just say, I'm not going to bullshit you. I've literally no idea what you're talking about. You know, and I was dealing with also a team based in Paris. My French is kind of workable, but obviously they were kind enough to work with me in English. And you know, they have terms, for instance, like bending, which I thought was a mispronunciation of blending, but no, it's not. It's actually a specific thing, and I probably got about 4 months in before I realised, oh no, I've been using the wrong term. This is embarrassing. And it's always good just to come clean and say, assume I know nothing, but I can learn very quickly. And even now, I'm not 100% sure how it all works, which is kind of great, because actually there's a lot more to learn. So, you know, when the next game comes along, I'll, you know, if you like, week two of the course will start again, which is great. And it's actually really nice doing something that you don't technically fully understand, because honestly, being a student is a good thing to be, you know, when it's in your professional life. And there's also massive danger, and I've found this sometimes in films, that when you, as a composer, sometimes you've made way more movies than the director you're working with, and sometimes it puts you in a position where, not that you know a lot, but you're very familiar with the process of what you're doing. And that can actually also be a massive disadvantage too, because it can sometimes end up feeling like, oh, I've been here before, I know what I'm doing here. And comfort is no friend, I think, to art.
When composing music for a new medium, especially one as complex as gaming, there's no room for complacency. It's made doubly hard if you're unfamiliar with the medium to begin with too, as was the case with Philip. Having never been an avid gamer himself, there was an extra learning curve alongside tackling the actual music. Yet, Philip found the experience fascinating and, in a way, liberating. After all, to someone who's practically done it all in his field, non-linear entertainment can pose a satisfying challenge.
I'm a complete and utter imposter. Until I started working with Quantic Dream, I was the proud owner of a PS1, which I don't think had come out of its box since my first daughter was born. Bearing in mind she's now 3 years into university, that might give you some idea of how up to speed I am with things. I'm not being on the cutting edge, I'll be honest. And having said that, when I was young, when I was at school, I was all over programming in BASIC, in BBC Basic. And in those days, I'm really going to show my age here. The first games I played were actually I had a Pong set up. That was really cool. Well, actually, I borrowed it, and then the Atari, and then I learned to hack the school's games, which were all on cassette tape for the BBC Micro. When I say hack, it was very easy to overwrite what the game was telling you if it was a text-based game, and obviously at that time the teachers had no idea what was going on. But that's probably the last time I got under the sort of bonnet of what was going on. But obviously, having kids, you know, I've got a young son who he's a total digital native and he's grown up in it. So yeah, that's been going on. But I've very much been an observer, and having said that, I'm quite involved with Twitch, which is kind of strange because that's completely the other side of the coin, really. But in a way, what's great is now looking at gaming, it is social. Whereas when I was a student, it was insular. It was very much you do this and you don't go out and you don't really have a life. Whereas now, it seems to be a way of creating hubs and little tribes and I see it doing a huge amount of social good. Even, for instance, for my son, who will sit and play whatever games they're on. He's only 12, and it's really a means to stay in touch with friends from previous schools, and then agree to meet up, and then they'll go and hang out on their bikes and things. That's actually a really good thing, and I think that's very different. I think I'm someone who's naturally frustrated with linear narrative in movies, with things being it starts here and it goes there, because great music doesn't really do that. Even if you think about, I don't know, Beethoven's string quartet or something, every time you hear it or you play it, it takes a slightly different route. Not in the notes you're playing, but in the emotional arc that's going on between the players and the audience. And I think the great thing about multi-linear narrative games is obviously there's a sense that they're in flux, and that in playing them you're affecting the outcome, but it feels like it's actually a conversation between the person who's made it and the person playing, which is why I think suddenly it's not just become dudes playing games, it's become younger girls playing, because suddenly there's a much more emotionally mature sort of mirror to the person playing, whereas I don't think that existed before. And I think whether you're into reading, I don't know, Jane Austen as a young person, or kicking a football around, you're always looking for something that appears to mirror, resonate and empathize with all the turbulence in your mind and brain as a young person. And suddenly if a game can appear to lockstep, it suddenly means a huge amount more. And I genuinely think that's why you have the sort of Comic-Con things, where you have people getting really deeply passionate about not just dressing as favourite characters, but learning all the music and actually trying to immerse themselves in the world, where previously that was a window that you looked through. It wasn't a door that you walked through and joined in. So I think that's great. And actually, now our kids are kind of left home, I can see that I probably would really get into games, but then I might not write enough music to pay the rent, so that could be dangerous too.
Philip came to video games with a great amount of respect and interest, which shows in his work. But how did Nima Fakhrara settle into Detroit? Without having to worry so much about how the medium would affect his music, Nima got straight to work constructing an unusual palette of sounds. None of his projects follow a template or set formulas, and David Cage's strong vision and characters provided some powerful inspiration.
The way it worked is that, at least I like to say it, it was a perfect match. I knew what David wanted. David knew how I could do it, and he allowed me at least to be able to kind of be open and experiment. And I'll be the first one to tell you, if I think that something doesn't work, it doesn't work. I throw it away and I rewrite it again. And I've always said this, and I've always said it to my filmmaker friends, video game friends, whoever I work with. If the music doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. And if all of a sudden a single note piano fits against picture, that's what it's going to go into the score. So for me, I'm not an egocentric person that kind of looks at picture and says, oh, okay, I'm going to do exactly what I did for Connor on my next film or next project, and that's not fun for me. And as composers and as filmmakers, as storytellers, we have to be able to, again, create a new language, create something fresh, so at least the audience doesn't get bored, and at least the people that are actually watching, listening, and things like that, to at least keep them engaged in the world of whatever it is. It's giving control and giving power to, and also hats off to the music supervisor, audio director, and David, basically to just kind of do what they wanted to do. Because Detroit was one of basically my biggest game that I ever worked on, it was one, and I do come from the world of kind of more or less film scoring. The cutscenes were done in the sense of it just kind of a story arc perspective, and what is basically the emotional sense of these cutscenes and what needs to be done there. I come from the world of not basically having a theme on every single scene and just hitting the audience over the head with the theme. But I'm one of those guys that just kind of keeps the theme in the back pocket until you actually need to hear it.
When a title concentrates heavily on story, its script is among the most useful assets to the audio team. Detroit Become Human's script, even by modern standards, is huge, allowing Nima, Philip, and John a lot of time to learn about each character and the world they live in. However, it's just as important that musicians get ample chance to actually play the games they're working on. For Nima, this may have been less of a problem, but how did Philip get around his lack of gaming experience to best understand Detroit?
The problem is my muscle memory, as I say, was actually for a PS1, and I'm a very good Wipeout player on the PS1. But actually, I think that's something to do with having a sort of musician's hands, that I can remember very complex movements and have no idea what's going on. But actually, I think my brain's too old to quickly learn a much better controller. It's almost like I've learned on Baroque instruments and suddenly someone's given me an electric guitar. I'm like, I've literally no idea how to get around this. This is embarrassing. So my solution was I paid my son, who was 10 at the time, to sit next to me and relentlessly play the scenes. Now, obviously this is an R-rated game, so we had to have a little chat that whatever went on in the studio, language-wise, stayed in the studio. But it was great. It was actually a really lovely bonding experience for us he knew he could genuinely help me and sort of patronize me in a way that, you know, a kid really likes to do. And then actually once we finished the project, I took him to Paris to the motion capture studios, and they let him sort of test the game for them as well. So the solution was right in front of me, you know. I'd given, but you know, the solution was part of my progeny, which was really awesome. Otherwise, I'm not quite sure. I would have had to spend a long time working the mechanics, because, as you know, it really is necessary to play through the branches, and obviously we're dealing with something that is, to all its intents and purposes, an animatic. Sometimes it's not even, doesn't even look like the final game. So that was great as well, because it helped me really understand the similarities between storyboarding and movies, and obviously animation that I might have worked on in the past. But also, when you're dealing with a 10-year-old kid who's looking at it, they're obviously looking at it from another way, thinking, oh, I never realized that that's how these things lock together. And yeah, these are all triangles in the end, but you know, seeing them in a rough early stage is kind of great. So yeah, that didn't end up being a problem, because I just subcontracted it. I paid him in PlayStation credits. How about that? It did mean for a few months he had some currency at school. You know, what are you doing this weekend? I'm working on a game where I can't talk about it. And I even made him sign a non-disclosure agreement. It was so funny.
In VGM, a composer wouldn't get very far if they relied solely on art design and story beats. Carefully considering gameplay, and working to complement it is a must, even if you need a little help from family. Detroit Become Human's gameplay is heavily based in choice and the various branching possibilities that come with your decisions. It can unfold in numerous ways and spiral in unexpected directions. So just how much did Nima consider the many paths available in Detroit and its running theme of choice?
Oh, it was absolutely something that I was kind of looking at throughout the entire thing. I mean, one of the things is that I asked David to send me the script when to be able to kind of see what the actual character arc is and actually see what the different choices. And as I was writing, I was aware that there need to be different avenues that this path can take. And it was one of those things that I was very conscious of as I was finishing the project, and as I was writing as well, that at any point the storyline could shift to more of a deviant Connor and to more of a human Connor. So I was conscious of. So I knew what I was doing.
Beyond choice, the story of Detroit Become Human is defined by musings on artificial intelligence and its potential place in society. All 3 playable characters are androids, bound by their programming. Yet, as you progress through the game, you learn that some androids are able to break their digital shackles and become deviant. Deviancy plays an important role in the narrative, and for Connor, it looms in the background as a potential result of your actions. It's not inevitable by any means, so how did Nima incorporate that possibility into his score and seed hints of it?
When I was writing the score, it wasn't so much in It wasn't so much in my kind of playground of figuring out, oh my goodness, what is the idea? Is it going to go to a deviant side? And how? And of course I knew that, but it wasn't more or less. Oh, I was very conscious about it. It was all in my subconscious of like figuring out. Okay, so this if Connor is who he is, and if he has a deviant side, what is it going to sound like? I never asked that question, I just did it. And I guess it was just basically of my understanding of Connor and my just fully understanding what Connor is and who he is. But the philosophy of deviancy and philosophy of just actually generalizing of deviancy in my music, I guess it exists. I mean, it's something that who I am personally. If you will, I am a deviant as far as my musical language is concerned. I don't like going the same path that everybody else goes, and I like to have something that's unique, whether people like it or not. And I get in trouble with that as well. It's I like to do something that is out of the box, and that's just one of the things that I like doing, and some people like it and some people don't. I lived with this character, I lived with this project and this character for almost a year. Basically, when I first started till we finally delivered, it was a year. So it was my life, and it was something that I kind of grew up with in that very short amount of time. So it became myself. It became who I was. You could hear influences in there. You could hear different things that are my language, but it's also kind of Connor. And fortunately, it was really funny because I met Brian Deckhart, who actually plays Connor, and it's basically kind of we are kind of two separate human beings that were kind of put together to become Connor together. And it was really, really interesting to do that.
Although actors perform voices and provide motion capture, it's true that music contributes to characterization too. Themes and motifs help establish an individual's personality, illustrate their feelings, and can even underline their intentions. Therefore, there's a lot of pressure on composers to nail the right atmosphere, and even more so in a story-driven game. Though Philip is no stranger to motivic composition across his career, how did he handle it for Detroit Become Human? And what differs in the creation of themes for VGM?
I had to be simpler and clearer about motifs. And bear in mind that I think when I started writing my own music, the thing I didn't like writing was melodies. Listening back, if I'm critical of my early music in any way, it's that I write everything except the tune, if that makes sense. I'll kind of write, and even listening back on it now, they're like very busy accompaniments, which is fine. Whereas with gaming, you have to kind of say, here's 6 notes and you're going to hear these a lot. So you take more the John Williams approach, which is, movie like E.T., when you hear the theme for the first time, you've heard it 14 times already. It's been hidden in a top line, it's been a bass line, it's been disguised everywhere. And what you do is when you reveal it and the audience go, I'm feeling so much right now. Yeah, because we've played it to you a lot of times already. So in a way, writing for games means that you really have to pare it down to what will work on a single instrument without you being told what to feel, and then what will have enough economy to it to be able to be lots of different things. Because I promise you, if you have a 5-note tune that repeats a couple of notes, you can make it anything. I mean, you know this. Whereas if you have a 10-note tune that's very complicated, you've locked yourself straight into a corner immediately. So I think the main thing I've learned from the game writing that's really fed its way back into my writing now away from games is I am much more motif character orientated as a result, I think. As in, I can say, yeah, that's what I want you to listen to, not that's frame, this is now center, and here's the line that you're going to track consciously and subconsciously, which is good. That's definitely something that I think will make me a better composer, because I'm nowhere near it yet,
Kara's main theme is decidedly sparse, which makes it malleable enough to survive several variations. It appears many times in-game, in many different ways, so Philip needed something strong and memorable, but equally open to interpretation. To achieve that, the central melody focuses on 2 notes, and it's surprising how many emotions they can express. The theme also clearly identifies the instrumental palette that runs through Kara's portion of the OST. Thick, resonant strings, supported by subtle electronics and occasional piano, make up most of Philip's music for Detroit. However, that wasn't always the plan. So how did Kara's main theme develop? And when did live strings become a part of it?
I started with this presumption, as you say, that it was going to be something post. I don't know, post-steampunk, and I had this idea of I wanted to do something sort of retro electronica, so I was going to try and base it around the sound of like telex machines and faxes and modems and all the sort of thing that for me feel like they are historical electronica, because obviously, you know, it being a Android brain, it was going to be sort of synaptic and all that stuff. So I was quite excited about using what I considered to be a different starting palette, and I'm being a string player myself, I tend to start from strings. I thought, no, I'm going to start actually from, you know, strange instruments, whether it's things like, you know, little calculator pocket operators, which I kind of collect, all that kind of stuff, speak and spell, hacked, all that kind of stuff, which is kind of fun. And I started writing like that, and it suddenly felt like I was trying to match what was on the screen too closely, in as much as the presumption about, well, we know it's an Android, so what? You know, that then doesn't mean anything. And there's I think Alfred Hitchcock once said, if the music and the picture are doing the same thing, one of them has to stop. And I was actually just doing the same thing as the picture. And then, of course, actually, the point, once you start, you know, reading the script, which was massive, it was 1,500 pages, and I'm sure, as you know, that's 10 times longer than most games, you realise that the whole point isn't about, hey, I'm the robot. It's, I think I might be a mother. And being the father to 3 daughters, let alone a little boy, I thought, oh, I can tap into, you know, the parental thing. I know what that feels like. When you've got a feeling that you're trying to hit, whether it's a goosebump or a fear or a sense of warmth, it suddenly makes it much easier. And you think, well, from that I know I need to go straight into sort of soul. I need to go to what's the breathing sound like? What aren't we seeing on screen? And I thought, well, actually, what we're not seeing is soul. We're not. You know, you can apply that with music. And I did what I normally do, which is I leave my studio and I either go for very long walks or I travel. So, and this sounds way more exotic than it is. I went to Montana, which is somewhere where I often go hiking or writing, or sometimes both. It's a good place just to kind of clear out the head, because your phone doesn't really work there, and there's death around every corner. There's a bear around every corner who's hungrier than you are. And it sort of sometimes can be a really good jolt. And I was staying in this really lovely place, which is near a small lake. When it snows there, it's like 4 foot snow. And I had this room where there's a fireplace. And I remember just thinking, well, I just need to do that thing of being very restrictive, where, yes, there are 12 notes, but if I only allow myself 2 notes, let's see how that goes. And the theme just kind of popped out into my head, because I thought, well, I'll take Kara's name, and I'll just use that as if it's someone just saying it. Like a child saying, and they're not saying mother, they're saying Kara, because it's not a mother-daughter relationship. Kara. And I just started from that point. I thought, well, that'll be a little rising note, so I'll just repeat it, and then I'll take that line for a walk, and that's it. And I thought, okay, that feels like it means something. And as long as you always come back to your starting note, you can walk anywhere with a tune. And this is not my idea. This is the artist Paul Klee used to say, you know, drawing is just taking a line for a walk. But it's always important to come back to where you start, because then the listener will kind of let go and trust the line, if that makes sense. But then to make it work, I needed a sort of background ambience and texture, and the fireplace was just doing it. It's going, it's kind of spittering and sputtering, and somehow I've always had this thing of trying to represent other senses in music, which is really hard. You can kind of do touch in a weird way. Smell is really hard, and I thought, I love the smell of wood smoke. I mean, it's probably poisoning me while I'm sleeping in the room. I don't care. I love it. And somehow getting that flickering of the flames and that smokiness. And there's nothing more analog. There's nothing more human than something burning and making light. And then if I was really being pretentious about that, hell, why not? You could say there's the whole Prometheus thing there, isn't there? There's the thing of, well, the fire from the gods is what creates life, right? There's the thing of, which is a very, very ancient idea. I thought, actually, if I worked that idea and I never tell anyone, whoops, told you now. I don't think I've ever talked about that, but it is this thing, if when you steal fire from the gods, that's when you create life. I thought, well, that could be my background story. A bit like when an actor says, what's my motivation? All that nonsense. And I put that in there, and suddenly the tune honestly just wrote itself, probably within about 10 minutes. I didn't have a cello with me, so I had to write it down, just in a notebook, longhand, and then get home as fast as I can and record it. And it's weird because what was actually a two-piece part of counterpoint, which is tune and accompany weaving inside of it, ended up being for about 120 instruments in the end. But at the core, it's still a bloody simple two-note tune. That's it. Honestly, that's it.
As simple as Kara's main theme is when analysed, it's given depth by Philip's impressively holistic composition. The piece, and the soundtrack it's a part of, capture Kara's character completely. From the melody itself to the instrumentation that plays it, you gain a real sense of her arc and growth. Even some of the recording and production techniques lean into Kara's budding personality. For example, there can be a real crunch to Philip's sounds, with bows scraping against strings and momentary bouts of percussive intensity. That grit directly reflects the childlike development of android consciousness, subtly evoking the emergent soul within.
And that's a really good point, actually. I hadn't thought of it that way. So yeah, I'm a great believer that if you use an instrument, whether it's a voice, a piano, or a bowed string instrument, if it doesn't sound a little bit dirty, if you don't have grit, and if you don't have this sense of ugliness, fugliness that can then you can't turn to beauty. And I think you sometimes need to show the working, show the effort, show that it's not lovely, in order to then do that reveal. So when you do go glossy and you go you land an accord that's a real payoff and it sounds beautiful, you've earned it. And the kind of parallel, let's get pretentious again, the parallel I would make is if you go, I don't know, into the Pompidou Centre and you got really close to the Picassos that they've got there, which are quite large, some of their collection, and you go up close, they are so ugly. They're just gobs of paint and hair and sort of grit, and they are. It's almost like there's no care taken with the close-up texture, but actually the opposite is true. It's just like it's kind of visceral, and actually the effect when you pull away and you see the trees for the wood, as it were, is that your brain locks it down into being cogent and lovely. Now, the equivalent of those sort of gritty bits up close is actually when you hear a player in the orchestra sniff or breathe. In the old days, you take that out. You kind of go, well, that's going to be disturbing. Now you amplify it. And as a player, playing the game, you might not be aware that you're hearing it, but suddenly everything around the game is very human, and therefore humane, because you can literally hear the effort going into it. And I'm a great believer, if you see or hear or perceive effort, you receive it, the message, whatever, much more openly. It's the difference between seeing somebody chopping ingredients and cooking a meal for you and getting it out of the microwave. Your brain is always going to tell you that the first thing is better than the second one. So actually, I believe that on a sort of personal level with playing as well, is that you have to show the amateurishness. I'm talking about my own playing. I mean, I'm a good cellist, but I will always show something ugly in order to then pay off and make people go, oh, okay. It's funny enough because you go into the stems of something like a Stevie Wonder track, and even though it's massively sophisticated, about 10% of everything you're hearing is valve hum and crunch and click and stuff that actually 10 years ago we would have taken out of every single stem in that recording. But actually it gives it soul, literally. That's where it lives, you know?
Philip's instrumentation, melodic choices, and production were all just right for Fakhrara. Without giving too many story spoilers, that soul is absolutely integral to her portrayal, which sits in stark contrast to Connor's. As an android designed to track and prevent deviance, his personality can be a lot colder, though decisions made by the player have the potential to drastically alter his actions. Nima cleverly accounted for that in his soundtrack, but as a backbone, electronic instrumentation does the heavy lifting. Analog synths, like the Mini Moog Voyager, were key to composing for Connor, which, by their very nature, bring a lot more warmth than most digital equivalents.
So the Voyager, the thing is that when I first kind of started writing the score, there was the biggest challenge was not to make it sound like other scores and have its own unique character. And one of the biggest things that I wanted to also be true to was Connor himself and his own emotional as well as physical standpoint. He is a robot, quote-unquote android, and he does have a robotic feel to it. And one of the things that I wanted to do was actually to create something that was both kind of subharmonic and at the same time something that is deep in your heart versus just you being able to hear it. And the idea of a bass line came into play, and I was kind of just messing around with different instruments. And basically the Voyager came into play of being able to do this idea of Connor's thematic bass line. And then one of the things that about the Voyager that was kind of special about it, it is that its polyphony and the way that it works, and it being able to bend into each other and bend into one note to the next, and that's basically how the Voyager was played into the whole score.
The Mini Moog Voyager is a defining sound in Nima's music for Connor, where its rich tones and depth act as a perfect mirror for the character. It wasn't just utilised as a synth on its own either. Its filter settings were often used to change the colour or timbre of other instrumentation too. Filters, envelopes and oscillators make up the majority of dials on an analog synth, and adjusting their settings drastically affects the resulting sound. Such filters were an important tool in Nima's arsenal for Detroit, so how did he apply them across his score?
I guess the Moog filter is a very signature sound of an entire kind of generation of synthesizer gurus, if you will. It has its own character, it has its own thing that it does, and a lot of the score was actually fed into that Mini Moog filter. And it does create this interesting character. I mean, Basically, a filter, for in layman's term, is the way I like to call it is just a kind of a sound blanket that goes on top of a sound, and then you could slowly bring it out and just kind of put it back in. So, and the mini Moog, at least for me, a Moog filter is a one of the best filters out there, especially for what I was doing for that character and for the characteristic of the music itself. And a lot of the instruments that was actually being played in the score was thrown into the filter as well. Fortunately, my studio has because I have a very good staff that I work with, but I'm one of those people that I lock myself in a room that I don't allow people to kind of be here while I work and stuff like that. My studio is wired in a sense that I could jump from one thing to the next very easily, and anything can be routed to something else very easily. So, as far as technical stuff is concerned, basically the Voyager was in the center of all of it. There was a feed that was being sent from my sequencer directly to the Voyager, and it directly coming out, and it would just adding colors, and it was being able to kind of utilize that filter. There was as far as technical stuff is concerned, there was a lot of tube microphones, two preamps that was being used as far as just warming up the sound itself. I like taking things out of the computer or out of the synthesizers and just running it through other things to just seeing what happens with them. There was a lot of kind of manipulation as far as modular synthesizers were concerned. There's a couple of modulars that I love using. One of them is called, I think, the Mangrove Sisters, I believe. Mangrove and Sisters are two things that was used a lot in the score. Basically, the family of Moog, anything that was just kind of being used in that in the score was very much Moog driven. There was a Sub 37 as well in there, and that has a very aggressive filter, and a lot of the percussion stuff was driven through that as well.
Nima's soundtrack for Detroit is a real treat for synthesizer nerds by managing to mix together an impressive lineup of hardware, complete with some particularly intriguing musical gadgets. Unlike traditional analog synths, modular synths are generally a lot more complex. They're a lot larger, a lot older, and come with a tangled web of interweaving patch cables. Nima's interest in modular synthesis, which does pop up in Connor's score, eventually led him to Folktech, a fascinating company known for some rather ingenious creations. Many of their experiments deal with melding synthesizer technology with actual microphones and acoustic elements. The Resonant Garden is a prime example of their output, featuring sprouts of strings from an elegant box, which can then be pinged, flicked, bowed, or interacted with however you see fit to generate sound. Something that marries physical and electronic qualities so closely is an inspired choice for a character like Connor. So how did Nima incorporate the Resonant Garden into his palette?
I'm actually a big fan of modular synthesizers, and how I got introduced to that is actually through a company called Folktech. They're a synthesizer company out of Portland, Oregon, here in the U.S., and they create these really interesting. I like to call them sculpture, but also they make noise. So one of the things that they do very well is acoustical synthesis, that you physically be able to kind of play something. the beauty of the instrument is that you could actually physically play it, and it is a modular synthesizer. So it has modular and computerized technology inside of it, but you could actually physically play it. And that was one of the most important things. I mean, that's just a philosophy that I actually have always had in my career and also in my musical language, that even if I create something synthesized, I want to be able to physically play it. And that's where the custom instruments and all the kind of fun stuff that I do, and just I guess the rabbit hole that I like to go down in.
Unlike Nima's third of the soundtrack, electronic instrumentation rarely comes to the forefront in Philip's. Many of his pieces are peppered with subtle complementary textures, but strings, and sometimes piano, are usually the focus. Nevertheless, there are several things you can do with purely acoustic sounds, in some ways similar to a synth's use of filters. Kara's OST is given a lot of intricate detailing thanks to Philip's creative composition, though he also picked up some clever trickery after years of writing for a diverse list of projects and artists.
I think I learnt about 8 years ago to cluster stuff in the top end of the register. So right out in the sort of spectral top range, I would always put a sort of disturbed cloud of harmonics and overtones. This is very high frequency. I learnt, weirdly enough, to do that when I was working with Scott Walker. I used to do a lot of string arranging for him, and whenever he'd do something that sounded dangerously like a comfortable chord, he would do a cloud of weird shit, excuse my French, at the top. Right. Actually, that's quite good, because it means you'll be sitting here thinking, oh, this is nice, but there's something nagging you here. They're going, no, be uneasy, which was his MO. So there's always been that, and sometimes you can do that and make something beautiful, but just with a little bit of sort of spice in it. Now, with the sub stuff, I think for me, that came from sitting in a decent cinema and then hearing sounds that I knew I couldn't possibly record, that were sort of, you receive them in your chest and you think, how do they do that? And I realised it was simply that, like you say, you need to do something that goes just below the level of audible range, but where your body still has a visceral reaction to it. And I think I did it by accident, because I was recording a Steinway piano note, and for some reason, it's still the same sample that I recorded years ago. I then, as I say, pitched it down and made it 2 octaves below any given bass line. And suddenly the whole track, everything that sits above it, feels like it's on this kind of, I don't know how to put it, like cushioning. But at the same time, it gives it, and I don't run a sub in my studio, weirdly enough. I always want to perceive it even through regular monitors, just as this sense of warmth and kind of push. And you're right, because the EDM world has done this so effectively, and my musical training, once I got beyond the Royal Academy of Music, really my ears were opened once I started writing with people like Uncle. And then Pretty Lights, who's been a big influence on me. And once you get to Odessa and all those kind of people who I now write with regularly, they do what they're writing I consider to be post-classical music, in as much as it's very much about the quality of the instrumental sounds, and then being very, very spare with all the clutter in the middle. You actually remove, you filter things out, so you're left with kind of beauty at every level, and then gut punch at the lower end. Because when you do use a kick sound, it needs to carry all the information and then get out of the way, which I love. It's different in things like dubstep or whatever, where you're sort of, quite often you're making people track the bass line, and that sort of grinds away. But I think that's in a way gone out of fashion you know, that it's a necessary stage for it to go through, but the kind of what stuff is kind of, you know, we've had enough of that. Thank you very much. But I've very much learned from that, and sitting and taking apart Ableton files, you know, that Odessa give me sometimes, and learning from that has really helped me, I think, as a sort of hybrid composer, understand that you can really make people feel a lot by what they're not hearing, which is great. But yeah, you're right. The sub stuff for me has definitely become now part of my, if I had a sound, it's definitely part of my sort of go-to weaponry. Even if I'm writing a solo piano piece, if you listen to it, it's always got a sub hidden in there.
Since Philip did a lot of his work in London's legendary Abbey Road studios, the tools available to him were quite different to Nima's collection of synths and custom instruments. That said, we already know that Philip is no stranger to experimenting with extra layers, like pads, textures, and even beats. All of those meet up with strings and piano to represent Kara's character beautifully, just like the hybrid sounds in Connor's OST. While Nima explored resonant gardens and filters for his music, what kind of technology did Philip use, and how does he approach electronic equipment?
I'm a great believer in using equipment that you're not skilled with, because the accidents that you come up with when you use it will sometimes be core to your progress. So I use a push 2 controller for Ableton. I love Ableton. I know even less about it than I do about Logic, which I actually write in. And it's not that I'm using Ableton itself to necessarily sequence things, but the controller itself is beautiful, because you can use it and actually not be looking at a screen, and you can be playing around with waveforms in its own window. But when you hit the wrong button, it's a massive payoff sometimes. So what I tend to do is improvise at length, chop things up, randomly throw them into Ableton patches, and then improvise using the controller. So a lot of the screwed up sounds in my palette were from that, but they're quite often they're always originating from an analog source, so they are always coming from a real sound. And by analog, I also mean if I'm recording a piece of electronic equipment, I will record it through the air and then screw the sound up and then put it back in, which I think is what I have in common with Nima as well, because he's someone who I think treats analog synths as historic instruments, you know, and the room sound is just as important, and I believe in that myself, but as well very much. I'm not much of a gearhead, but I'm a great believer in tripping yourself up with interesting interfaces, and that's definitely the Ableton for me was really good. To the extent that if I was going on holiday, I'd pack it in my case. And I actually really love sitting down and playing with it. And it's a bit like the way I play the piano. I don't know, because I can't. And, you know, random chords, because my hands are unskilled on the piano, even though I learned for years, I still can't play it. I'm terrible. Actually, I can get much better harmonies than I can sometimes from thinking what would I want to hear, or even trying them on a cello, which is very much my skill set, you know. So I think the Ableton push 2 was probably really critical to it. And then I'm trying to think what else. I mean, it sounds really pretentious to say. I mean, the best bit of gear I use is probably Abbey Road. I was very particular with, and Andrew Dudman, who's my producer there, who's a total genius and the most modest man on earth. I can say to him, I specifically want the microphones that were used for the orchestra on the White Album. I'm like, yeah, they're up there. And you're going to go, okay, so now all we have to do is actually play really well. There's no excuse, really. And that does count. I mean, it's weird that vibe is really important, because what happens is the musicians, and I swear this is true, I go in that studio twice a week even now, and I have goosebumps every time I walk in. It's like if you're a religious person going into, I don't know, Cologne Cathedral and thinking, wow, this is more than I can ever be, right? Which is great. That's a good feeling. And also going into that room, if you don't bring your best work, you're wasting that room, and you're wasting people and all that stuff. But what's great is every member of the orchestra, when they walk in, I swear, has the same reaction. They might be in there every day of the week doing an Avengers movie, this and this. They still get that rush when they walk in. So funny enough, even that itself takes everything 40% more. Not better, just more. You know? And you hear that. Whereas if you do it in a sterile environment, or God forbid using samples, it will never, those goosebumps that the players are feeling will never translate.
Abbey Road barely needs an introduction. Of course, you're likely well aware of the Beatles album, known for its ubiquitous image of the Fab Four crossing the road itself. Interestingly, the studios were actually named after the album, and not the other way around. Before the Beatles, Abbey Road was known as EMI Recording Studios, founded in 1931 and still respected worldwide as a veritable mecca for musicians and fans alike. Philip has more than a little experience working there, not least during his time composing for Detroit Become Human. But what's it actually like to record at Abbey Road, conduct live sessions there, and rub shoulders with some of the best players and performers in the industry?
In this case, very specifically, we had 15 hours to record 85 minutes of music, which is fine. I mean, I'm someone who happily record an album in a 3-hour session. It's not a problem. It's kind of like, let's get to it. And the orchestra is so good that the second take is the one that you use. It's perfect. You know, the first take is let's get the microphones right, and the second one, we're good. Because I do a lot in the studio with those kinds of groups anyway. I'm sort of quite match fit with it, and my process is very specific in as much as I will, to be very inside baseball about it, as they say, I will have everything written and delivered to both the studio and even the person printing the parts probably 2 weeks ahead of a session. The conductor is easy to deal with, that's me. And the producer and the engineer are people I've worked with probably for the last, gosh, let me do the math, something like 15 years. On some very weird high pressure projects. So the guy running Pro Tools for me when I was working on the London Olympics is now one of my lead producers. And so he and I have dealt with very strange people in difficult situations. So when you're on a project that you're running, it's kind of lovely. You're in a good place. And then you just run the session in a way whereby you have it mapped out in an incredibly minute by minute way, and then you have to be able to pivot quickly if you change your mind. And yeah, we finished with 15 minutes to spare, as in we had 15 minutes free at the end, which was great. And bearing in mind, every minute is thousands of pounds. You have to be really careful to not go over. But that's sort of when you're standing on the podium and you've got the orchestra in front of you, it's the calmest I've ever felt in my life. It's always that moment when you think, okay, now we just have to record it. And it's lovely because suddenly everything sounds far better than what you've written. It's insane amounts of due diligence is what I'd say. And making sure that, and for instance, I will have personally checked every single part to make sure that a violinist isn't going to say, excuse me, should that be an F sharp? And sometimes if they do, I'll say, I know it is, and it is, if it sounds weird, it's meant to sound weird. Sorry, it's modern. But yeah, you've got to, because also the orchestra need to know 100% that you absolutely are sure of what you're doing. Even if inside your brain is screaming you're an imposter. And it still does, but that's kind of good. But the funniest thing that ever happened to me in Abbey Road is I was recording once in Studio 2, and it was for a movie. It's probably about my 30th movie, so it was kind of about halfway through. You know, it was a number of years ago. It sounds flash. 30 small movies. These are not big things. And I was aware that somebody was standing behind me, which is sort of quite rude. And you just, if you're conducting, having someone kind of on your shoulder it's kind of not a done thing. I thought, I wonder what's going on. And I finished conducting this particular cue. And the orchestra was sounding good, but I was still thinking, oh, they're going to know I don't know what I'm doing. And I turned round, and it was Sir George Martin, the fifth Beatle, is standing behind me, all elegant with his, sort of long hair, nice suit, elegant hands, kind of, folded in front of him. And he said, oh no, do carry on, dear boy. I'm like, oh, it's quite lovely. I'm like, oh, well, if George Martin thinks it's lovely, it must. Maybe it's all right. It's like that glow inside. It's a bit like having a papal blessing. I think, wow, my life is complete. I can die happy. I'm in this studio where he recorded those albums, and he's given me his blessing. And 15 minutes later, I'm up in the control box with my producer. I said, Sir George Martin said it was quite lovely. He just looked me dead in the eye. He said, he's deaf. Oh. It's like, I had 15 minutes that were probably the happiest 15 minutes of my life. Crushed. Which was lovely. It's very sweet of him. Then I dialed to his son, who's lovely, who I see very often. I told him that story. He killed himself laughing. He said, yeah, that is Dad all over. It's all about making people feel comfortable, which is why he was a great producer. So that's my takeaway from that, is what would George do?
Stories like that are always a privilege to capture for the sound test, and hearing such insight about a recording studio as respected as Abbey Road is a real highlight of ST2. In fact, I'd be tempted to say that thoughts on such a process would be hard to top, but Nima Fakhrara is no slouch himself. There's plenty of entirely acoustic instrumentation in his music for Connor, ranging from percussion to the Persian santur, and they're rarely featured without heavy physical or digital manipulation. Alongside various synthesizers, live performances help evoke the soul that lurks within artificial life, a detail far from lost on a talent like Nima.
I grew up as a percussionist, so percussion has been always my life, and that's why I throw in weird rhythms and weird concepts and stuff like that. So for me, those percussions are all played by myself, each and every single one of them, and they're overdubbed multiple times. And that's basically what they are. There are toms. There's a lot of detuned toms in there. There's a couple of timpanis that are recorded. There's a lot of weird hitting of instruments, mallets on instruments, stuff like that. As I said, I grew up playing Persian classical music, and I've been fortunate enough to be able to play with a lot of amazing masters. And the santur was actually my first instrument. I grew up with that instrument. It's like basically when someone picks up a guitar, that's what I picked up, or I should say, my parents forced me into it. It's basically it is the instrument itself, and I put a towel on it. There is on it, and it gives you this very interesting kind of texture. And one of the biggest thing was that, they're all at moments there are different kind of, if you will, there are different type thickness of towels that are thrown on it, but but yeah, that was the gist of it, and it's what I did, and I like bringing back kind of, I guess, my old roots to to project, and not having them sound like whatever they were.
Connor's sections sound so unique, precisely because of Nima's singular mix of diverse instrumentation. Both he and Philip incorporated live playing alongside electronics, for reasons we've already discussed, and usually in completely different ways to one another. For his soundtrack, Nima went as far as designing, building, and eventually recording Connor's guitar, a custom 20-foot frame with 4 lengthy strings. Suited best to subharmonic frequencies, the instrument plays a subtle but important role in the score. So how was Connor's guitar developed, and what goes into actually playing it?
I knew that I wanted something that, as I said, I wanted something that was subharmonic, and I knew something that I wanted something to be able to kind of create a drone. I've always been just, I guess, for the past kind of 3-4 years, I've always been in the search of finding a pad or a drone, if you will, to a technical term, but in layman's terms, something that could sustain over a long period of time without it feeling looped, and without it feeling that it's just being the same thing being repeated over again. And that for Connor it was the idea of what does the inside of Connor sound like, if it's a bunch of programs or if it's a bunch of mechanical things. And when I kind of came up with the idea of the guitar, when it first came into the studio, it didn't make noise at all, and it was one of those things that it took a while for us to kind of, for me at least, to realize the goal was for me to kind of create something subharmonically, and we realized that I had to kind of place contact mics as well as putting it through a synthesizer in order for us to be able to get that signal out, and in order for us to actually hear something out of the guitar. The great part about it is the unpredictability becomes predictable after a little while. I mean, and this is getting maybe too philosophical, but there's nothing wrong with it being imperfect, and there's nothing wrong with it being unpredictable. I guess that's the beauty of custom instruments, and that's the beauty of custom sounds. You never know what you're going to get out of them. I mean, and when the guitar came into the studio and I realized, oh my gosh, it's not making any noise. Did I just waste my time for 3 months designing this? It's something you kind of just do, and it's something that comes into play. It's the same thing with modular synthesizers as well as analog synthesizers. One day they will make you some sort of sound, and the other day they make you a different type of sound. It all depends on what the mood of the actual instrument is. Basically, it's kind of like when you're about to improvise on any sort of instruments. It all depends what the player is feeling like that day to see what the type of music they're going to kind of perform for you. Not kind of just and it's just that's how it is. If they feel sad, they're gonna play you sad music versus kind of happy music, and it's the same thing. It's putting it in kind of just very simplified way. It's the same thing with the Resonant Gardner. Kind of even if I kind of keep it the way that it is, and if I plug it out and plug it back in, it's just circuitry, and it's just they will deform. They will kind of become old. They will have their own character, and they will be unpredictable. So you just have to run with it.
Unpredictability is certainly a theme in Connor's third of the soundtrack. Even its production process defied convention, often by leaning into experimental techniques. Obscure gems like the Resonant Garden are one thing, but Connor's guitar is a prime example of the effort and individuality behind Nima's composition. There is one obvious similarity between his music for Detroit and Philip's though. Both use live strings throughout their scores, only in completely different ways. Rather than recording a session orchestra with acoustic instruments, Nima worked with an electric string quartet. Electric strings are perfect for on-stage performances, and like electric guitars, come alive when put through an amplifier or amp simulator. Yet Nima specifically wanted to explore how they sounded unplugged, and soon discovered how well their raw qualities fit with the project.
When I first started, the plan was to kind of record an orchestra and all that kind of fun stuff, and be able to kind of do a big session like Philip and John that they did for their characters. But after a little while, I basically realized that I'm not utilizing any real instruments in the project. Even if they are real, they're being completely manipulated and flipped on their head. And to stay true to the nature of Connor, sample instruments and sample libraries that were creating strings, woodwinds, and brass are mechanical, are kind of not perfect, are not humans. And I give all the credits to Mary or Leanne and David over there at Quantic to be able to kind of just say, okay, let's go and do a non-traditional recording session. And that's what kind of came about. And again, it was one of those things that I didn't know what I was getting myself into, calling up a couple of players and saying, hey, bring a electric instrument, but we're not going to plug it in. So basically the happy accidents happen, and kind of just that's how it became that. We recorded them extremely close with really old mics. I mean, I don't have a huge mic collection, and one of the things that I like using are these Octavias, these Russian old Russian microphones, and I've been able to kind of collect 6 of them in the studio, and that's what I use always, and they kind of create this really interesting tonality. But I capture these instruments extremely close, and then basically let the player play exactly the way that they want to play it, but then be able to kind of manipulate them in their tube mics and actually put some warmth back into it. A lot of the things that I do, I like capturing them very close, and being able to kind of be, and this is not just for Detroit, this is just my musical kind of, I guess, taste, is that I like capturing everything close and being able to hear the breath of the player. It gives a different feeling to it, and there's a lot of breaths of players in Connor's soundtrack, because we did have to overdub multiple times with these players, that it wasn't just basically four audio tracks. It was like more like 40 kind of audio tracks being overdubbed on the top of each other.
For Detroit, Nima formed impressively cacophonous string stabs and swells from recordings of 4 individuals. Their electric instruments profoundly underline Connor's artificial personality too, rightly contrasting with the predominantly acoustic sounds that accompany Kara and Markus. Close mic, unplugged sessions also offer a somewhat percussive quality at times, all the better for moments of intensity. To achieve all this, the musicians themselves had to be staunch professionals and open-minded enough to embrace some odd methodology. Naveed Hedjazi, who's no stranger to collaborating with Nima, took a central role in the electric string quartet, included in the credits as a featured player. What were Naveed's reactions to such unconventional recording sessions? And besides pure performance, how did he contribute to them?
Well, I mean, Naveed is a different monster than anything else. I've known Naveed for almost 12 years now, and we've become more of a collaborative. We've become more friends than collaborators. So he knew when I was kind of starting on the project, and I mean, Naveed has played on basically all of my scores, and one of the things was that kind of and the experimental things that Naveed is willing to do of detuning his instruments and things like that is what makes me go back to Naveed all the time and actually be able to just kind of tell him, hey, let's detune your instrument. For me, it's the players are absolutely as important as the writing itself, and each player brings something else to the table, and it's just kind of their background as well. So for me, and I've at least tried to do this, that I allow the players to do how they feel and play how they feel, and I will guide them if it's not what I'm looking for, but it's one of those things that I've been able to, fortunately enough, I've been able to work with some amazing players, and I've collected these amazing collaboratives in my arsenal to be able to kind of keep going back to, and they know what I want and I know what they can do. So there are a lot of times, I mean, even if you will, in classical composition, when you were gonna write a piano sonata, you knew who you were writing that for, and it's the same thing. It's like when I'm writing something and it requires an instrument, and I knew that I was going to do a string quartet, electronic string quartet, I knew the players that could do that. And the same thing with Naveed is, I'm not like, if I was going to just get any violin player to be able to do those very technical lines for Connor, I know players won't be able to do that. So I know what his capabilities are, and I always push him to do it. And if sometimes it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Again, it's just the accidents that are the greatest. I did record one solo French horn player that I wanted to actually grab, and that basically was kind of the same concept as with like Naveed, to just be able to kind of do stuff with it. So they are basically multiple brass samples, and then detuned strings, and then a mini Moog and an OB6. It's just basically a multiple of sounds going through distortion pedals and things like that. So it's just basically crazy sounds that go different ways. That's what they are.
Nima's approach to live instrumentation for Detroit was the absolute antithesis of Philip's. A full ensemble of acoustic players doesn't just sound different, but affects composition, recording, and production across the board. Because of strictly scheduled sessions and the musicians involved, Kara's soundtrack came with certain restrictions. In general, there was a lot less freedom for Philip to experiment during sessions, with some notable exceptions worth detailing. A piece called Dark Night, for instance, is made particularly dense by a 55-track wall of layered cello, all performed independently by Philip himself.
So with that one, there are 55 tracks, of very ugly cellos going on, in as much as some of it is all to make a kind of rising tone, like a kind of Sheppard tone almost, that builds up. And if you played every single semitone in the scale and then made them all glissando, made them all slide upwards over a long time, that's what some of what they're doing. And sometimes it's to make a big wodge of a chord. Now, in the case of that particular track, I had all of it recorded in my home studio before the orchestra got put on top. And that was very important because I want the orchestra to react to this kind of wall of cello, if that makes sense. Because if the playing itself is intentionally sort of gritty and slightly ugly, I want the orchestra to also go along with that too. And I'll be quite honest about that. So, because sometimes it will be what they're hearing is sort of quite disturbing in comparison to the sound that they're making. But I need that counterpart, that counterplay, in order for it to work. So I will, certainly for the first couple of takes, I will play it to them so they're hearing all of it. I love using a wall of cello because you can do everything with it, and then the orchestra doing everything that it can't do, and that's sort of they then need to fill out the whole of the rest of the spectrum. But even if you've got all of those 100 or so instruments going on, they all still need an individual bandwidth in order to kind of not clutter up and sound muddy, which is kind of hard to do. But I like making sure that the very last thing to go on is the orchestra, because there's also, it's a bit like in a magic trick. The prestige is when you put the real orchestra on, suddenly everything just opens up and becomes what you've pictured all along, hopefully. And it's a good moment as well for the production team or the director, where they suddenly go, oh, I see what you mean. Whereas they've been hearing my cellos all along, which is, this wall of fugly. And then suddenly you lay an amazing gloss across it and you go, oh, okay, yeah, we're all right, we'll be okay. And that's it. So there's a little bit of gamesmanship in that as well. But actually it's a good part of the process, because then when you go to mixing it, you're dealing with things that you have not been living with for a year, and it gives you the energy to make it sound decent.
It was only natural for Philip to include some of his own performance in Kara's OST. After all, cello is the instrument he's most comfortable with, and that's why he could use it so effectively for tracks like Dark Knight. His playing appears elsewhere in Detroit too, most notably in Little One, a tender piano rendition of Kara's main theme that has proved very popular with fans. It sticks out on Philip's score, which is otherwise drenched in strings, by taking a gentler, more minimal approach. How does Philip feel about the strong audience response to Little One, especially considering its stark contrast with the rest of his soundtrack?
I think, here's the weird thing, I think the reason that I've sent out so many copies of the sheet music of that is because I sound like a 14-year-old trying to play the piano, So there's an honesty in the crapness of my playing. And I genuinely mean that, in as much as you can hear there's a little bit of a struggle. But also, the trick there is there's a real piano, and then there are two different pianos shadowing, which are tuned slightly differently. And here's a really important thing. If something is tuned too close, you get back to that sterility thing. You get to that thing of it sounding uncanny. But if you let one of the pianos be, say, an eighth of a tone out of tune, and yet it's in tune with itself, it's a bit like when you have 3 people, 4 people singing together. Those individual voices will, in the brain of the person listening, blend, but you can still pick them out individually, which is really important. So there's sort of a Victorian piano in there, and there's an upright piano, and then there's the actual one in the center, which is kind of the real one. But they're all meshing and knitting together, but they are fundamentally out of tune with one another. I'm never embarrassed by the fact that I can't play. I would worry if I learned how to if that makes sense, because I think it wouldn't then. I'd just be a bad pianist. Whereas at the moment, I'm no pianist, but I approach it as a percussion instrument.
It's obvious how much passion and thought went into all 3 original soundtracks for Detroit. That's exactly why this podcast is among the longest I've ever produced, even considering the absence of John Paesano. But, as we've explored the music of Nima and Philip in depth, we've also done so without discussing collaboration. There are times in the story where playable characters meet, and the audio follows suit by melding their musical themes. Though rare, such moments can be incredibly powerful. So how did they develop from a trio of otherwise independent scores?
At the beginning till the very end of the project, we were not technically allowed to listen to each other's music. We were given freedom to do whatever we wanted to do without listening to other people's, to each other's. And I think that actually created a very unique world for each character. At the end, once kind of our musical language was created, there were scenes that there are characters that are crossing each other, and that needed to be kind of something that either I would take John, who did Markus, and basically Phillips, who did Kara's. Basically, I would take theirs, or they would take my music, and they would do their own thing with it. But it was till very end of the project that we got to quote unquote collaborate on the music. But before that, it was just kind of do our own thing, and then we'll figure it out as we get to there.
We started this project thinking that we were all going to get together in Paris and kind of jam, John, Nima, and myself, and kind of form the world's strangest jazz trio, I think. And sort of co-write things and then go our separate ways and develop our own characters. But I think the moment we all started writing sketches, I think Mary, who was our sort of lead audio producer at the studios, Mary Lockwood, who's an absolute genius, by the way, realised that we were probably doing fine without communicating. And the weird thing is, I think the process entirely matched what happens in the game, which is the characters are all satelliting around each other, but they're not actually having meaningful contact until much later on. And we didn't talk at all. That's not really, and short of some pleasant email exchanges. And I realised what happened was we naturally fell into not our go-to sound worlds, but the places where I think David Cage, to his credit, had spotted that he probably would want us to write from. So John obviously has the quite an epic sort of sound, big orchestra choir. It's kind of like biblical epic, which is great. And I think Nima's always had this thing, like you say, of searching for the deeply analog electronic. Whereas obviously I think David had come to me because they'd used a track of mine when they were first cutting the idea of Kara some time ago, but it was very much sort of driven Appalachian sort of, but weird, screwed up strings, that's my thing. And that's obviously, ironically, what I came round to in the end. So we were all operating, if you like, within a bandwidth that was completely separate. But had you put them together even early on, we wouldn't have actually been getting in each other's way from a sound point of view, which is really, really strange if you think about it. It's a bit like, here's the front line, the mid line, and the back line, and they kind of lock together. Now, as far as the collaboration goes, it was quite. It sort of just worked in as much as I think I had a sequence where Kara is running across the motorway or freeway, whatever we're saying in America, or and Mary realised that she could lay Nima's track over it, and the whole thing locked together. So I can take no credit for that. I think Nima had more to do with making that work. I sat back and watched other people do some brilliant things to it, to be quite honest with you. And here's the thing, it's the first time I've ever surrendered stems, which are the individual lines of music, to a producer, to Mary Lockwood, and then it's come back being a much more interesting piece of music in a few cases. That's really good, and I will always give her credit for that, because actually I could say, yeah, well, it took ages and I was very clever, what you all did with it. No, that's someone with really good ears saying, I think that will fit into that. And actually that's the point also of having a year's process, is the person who's then overseeing it all can have a very good holistic overview of, actually I think that strand with that one will lock together. And we were recording individual lines in the studio with a full orchestra that I never had any clue would work as individual lines, but actually someone having the brains to know how the mechanics work will kind of go, actually that riff of semiquavers and the violas is going to really help me out of a spot later on in the game that you don't even know about. Great, let's just record it right now. Everyone else go and have a coffee, we'll just record that for 3 minutes. That's the intelligence we're dealing with here. And that was sort of the brilliance that was going on behind this, far cleverer than I think anything I was doing.
The audio team were just as dedicated to making Detroit a deeply immersive and thematic experience as the composers themselves. That same attitude can be found in every department when it comes to Quantic Dream, who set an amazingly high standard for production quality. As if 3 magnificent soundtracks from well-respected composers weren't enough, the official OST comes with a 4th disc of licensed songs, including artists like Emily Rose, Thornetta Davis, and the Whiskey Charmers. Quantic were very careful about the pieces they chose. In fact, the real-world city of Detroit, and its bustling live music scene, provided every band and artist featured. Such an authentic detail is, at this point, just more proof of the care poured into the release, and it doesn't stop there. Incredibly, when putting all 4 discs of Detroit's score to one side, there's still more to hear. To reward players for their hard work and curiosity, several extras, like concept art and videos, are made available for purchase with bonus points. In some versions, you can find an interesting gem called the Minsky tapes, only heard during gameplay in the house of Elijah Kamsky. The similarly named Minsky refers to none other than Marvin Minsky, a cognitive scientist and Turing Award winner with a stunning body of work on the subject of artificial intelligence. Inevitably, his contributions to the philosophy of AI were an influence on the narrative of Detroit, and in a strange twist of fate, he was also a personal friend of Philip Sheppard's, and a musician himself. That kind of serendipity is impossible to ignore, so some of Minsky's own piano performances, beautifully orchestrated by Philip, soon made their way into the game.
Marvin Minsky had been a friend of mine for a number of years, and Gloria, his widow, had let me listen to a lot of archives of him playing the piano. And it's funny, I first met Marvin kind of over dinner once, and I hadn't really clicked who he was. He was just really fun, and he'd sit in the corner and play the piano, and he wasn't performing, he was just playing because it sounded nice. And he'd write little bits of music that sounded a bit like Bach inventions. And there's a big brain going on in there. I mean, this guy invented the whole concept, a working concept for HAL for Kubrick for 2001, and he's the person really behind the structure of what we now know as artificial intelligence. But he's just a very nice guy, and my relationship with him, as I say, was kind of social and not particularly intellectual. But he was very nice about he came and heard me play the cello a number of times, and I became friends with his family. So when his daughter told me there was this archive of recordings of him on reel-to-reel tape, I was like, I really want to hear those. I tuned it a little bit, and I restructured the way that the tune worked, so it came back on itself, because Marvin hadn't actually organised, weirdly enough, a structured brain. He'd just done it as a sort of stream of consciousness. So I wrote a whole orchestral part around it, and I snuck it into the recording session and said to David afterwards, listen, I've written this piece, and I don't know if you know who Marvin Minsky is. And he sort of, his face went, he went, what? Mark, how do you know about him? I said, well, he was a friend of mine. He said, well, Kaminsky, the character in the game, is built around him. I said, well, that's interesting, because here's this. And I played in the track that we'd snuck into the recording session. I said, Easter egg? He went, yeah, okay. I have an idea. So we worked it into the game, and I do love the idea that you can unlock Marvin if you look, and that maybe it was great because we put a little biography for him in there as well in the details of the game, so if people want to know more they can kind of dig into some of his writings and stuff. But this is the guy who taught Arthur C. Clarke, who taught Richard Feynman. He's really one of the biggest brains ever to have lived in terms of physics, mathematics, robotics, all that stuff. And it was important to me that we buried that in there somewhere, and it made a nice sort of sub-layer to what was going on. But that sound world was also pretty core, I think, to everything else that I wrote. It was very much like an encapsulation of the symphonic and the found kind of noise, if you like, so that represents quite well.
The Minsky tapes are a final example of the inspiration that runs through Detroit Become Human. Everyone involved brought their very best to the project, from David Cage to each of the three composers and the wider audio team surrounding them. Detroit is a stunning achievement when seen as a whole, but it only gets more impressive as you dive deeper into its intricacies. There's no doubt that this podcast will be among the longest I've ever produced, and previous episodes of a similar length have concentrated on entire game series or eras. It's simply stunning how much passion and creativity is packed into Detroit Become Human, with still a third of its soundtrack left to discuss. Hopefully, I'll be able to fill that gap by speaking to John Paesano in the future and give his music the attention it deserves. Markus's OST is its own singular joy, worthy of equal praise and analysis, sitting right by Kara's and Connor's as one part of a remarkable package. Until that possible follow-up, this nearly 2-hour special has been an honour to put together, fueled completely by the candid wisdom of Nima and Philip.
The world of film, video game, commercial, just anything that is composed to picture, if you will, or to any medium, composed to any medium, has changed. And the idea of evolving through this change is extremely important. And for composers, at least for myself, I consider myself a storyteller than anything else, than someone that is just writing to write a score. I have to be able to tell that story.
I honestly had no concept of the effect that music had on the players, if you like. I mean, you know it's very important, but up until that point, I hadn't met people who had grown up like yourself through music and games. That's completely bizarre to me. I'm someone who's grown up through concert halls and then broken into EDM or working with rock musicians or whatever, but seeing it from someone coming in a very valid way from maybe, I don't know, Final Fantasy, or previous games to that, from needle drops as well, some ways, and then coming through this pathway whereby, yes, Hollywood composers are writing for games, but then you're getting native games composers coming along and completely changing the way that young people relate to hybrid music. And by hybrid music, I mean that your average 12-year-old even is very comfortable with a symphonic, electronic, and I don't want to say rock, because it's not quite right, but studio palette of sound, where 10 years ago even, that would have been pretty alien and would have shut people out because they think, well, that's just classical. Whereas now, that world is completely open. And I think what's changed for me is that I've always had this sense that you should gamify music composition, hence the games that I've made for kids around composing. But I've never realised that's already been going on in the video game world. I was actually quite naive in that way about it, I think. And I think there's a huge opportunity to open up the compositional process through gaming as well. It already happens when you play a game, you are effectively producing your own soundtrack. I'm very excited about the next stage of that, where actually you are consciously moving sound around in time and space in the way that, we've probably created a generation of architects because of Minecraft. I love the idea that we'll generate a whole generation of composers through video game music. I think that's really great, and actually the barrier to entry can be low, but the technical prowess can be really high. The sophistication that people get and the mental acuity through playing games, which is undeniable. I mean, it's all the scientific studies show that it helps your coordination, your development, your cross brain development. Once you start bringing musical composition into being a strong part of that, it fills out, I think, the sense of achievement you can get as somebody actually physically making something and getting your hands dirty and thinking that piece of music exists because I am here and I did that. Now, for anybody, whether they're my advanced age or whether they're a 10-year-old sitting in their bedroom playing a game, that sense of ownership and of creativity is critical to being a human being. Not to be too pretentious about it, but I think any psychoanalyst will tell you this. The moment that someone feels that they have created something that is uniquely theirs, it helps them build their own identity. And at an age when one's sense of self might be fluid or up for question, game music has a big responsibility and a lot to do there, I think, which is great. So it's filling a big gap.
Thanks to Nima and Philip for speaking to me for the sound test, but thank you too for taking the time to listen. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please make sure to follow or subscribe on whatever platform you might be listening on. On my next documentary podcast, the sound test kicks into full gear with a dedicated racing special. Although mostly known for licensed music, many top racing franchises made incredible and underrated use of original composition. Even a soundtrack consisting of pre-existing songs by established artists can be curated masterfully. But the real power of a good racer hides in its sound design, where every rev and collision matters. To cover all that and more, I'll be joined by TDK, Steve Rocket, and Ian Livingston, legends of the genre whose music and audio can be heard across various F1, MotoGP, Colin McRae, and Forza titles, to name just a few. If you'd like to hear that podcast early, ahead of public release, head on over to patreon.com/_secret cave. There, you can pledge your support for as little as £1 or $1 to unlock early access to podcasts, unedited interviews, full quality WAV files, a full backlog of otherwise unavailable live shows, and more. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this edition of ST2, and don't forget to join me every Friday, 7 PM UK time, for a live and interactive show of VGM Celebration.